Elidor by Garner. 10. Choke. Of course it seemed different once he was on the train. In the brightly lit compartment and among other people he realized that there could be no normal explanation for everything. He knew that static electricity could produce strange effects, and the engineer had said there was a lot of it in the house. He had frightened himself before by staring at something quite ordinary in a poor light. "Come off it, Roland, you're always imagining things." That was a family joke. When he reached home, Roland put the treasures on a high shelf in the garage, where they would be unnoticed until they could be hidden in the loft over the bathroom. By now, most of his fright had dropped away. He left the garage, crossed to the house, and shut the kitchen door behind him, all rather quickly, but already the impression of what he had seen was becoming very confused. The shadows were not so clearly shadows. They could have been faults in the wall plaster shown up by the torchlight, or an effect of the dust and the static electricity somehow. Friday was the best day of the week. After tea, homework could wait. The first cloud would not appear before Sunday evening. A whole evening lay ahead to be enjoyed. The children washed up while their mother arranged sandwiches and cake on a trolley for supper. Mr. Watson went out in the car to buy a box of chocolates to celebrate their first week in the cottage, and then he brought in coal and stoked the fire. "Did you get them?" said David to Roland. "Yes, they're in the garage." "What is it on TV tonight, Frank?" said Mrs. Watson from the sitting room. "I'm just looking, dear," Mr. Watson answered. "Do you know anything about static electricity?" said Roland. "A bit," said David. "There was an engineer from the post office at the house. He said there had been complaints. He said the house was full of static electricity and—" "It's a circus, then a play, and then ice skating," said Mr. Watson. "Oh, good! Hurry up, children. The circus is on in a few minutes, and there's a play and ice skating." He said there must be a generator. "Right, Mum," said David. "Coming." A generator wouldn't give static. But there were sparks everywhere, little blue ones. "Never mind," said Nicholas. "Leave it. Dad's just switched on." The family settled down by the fire. The box of chocolates was passed round. Mrs. Watson sighted her footstool. Mr. Watson polished his glasses with a special cloth impregnated with silicones. They all sat in expectation. The first thing that happened was that as the television set warmed up, it gave out an electronic howl, which climbed the scale until it was like a knife driven through the teeth, and then sank to a scream. "It's a tuning note," said Mrs. Watson. "Doesn't sound like it to me," said David. "Turn it down a bit, Frank, till it's warmed up," said Mrs. Watson. "It'll be all right." The scream died and broke into a staccato cough. "That's not a tuning note," said David. The television set blinked, and for a second they glimpsed the head and shoulders of an announcer, and then it looked as if a motorcycle had ridden over his face, leaving the tread marks on the screen and dragging his nose and ears sideways out of the picture. "It's the contrast, Frank." Mr. Watson heaved himself from his chair and began to turn the controls. He was too near to see if he was doing any good. It seemed to be raining in the studio. "That's better," said Mrs. Watson. "No, you've gone too far back. Oh, that's no good. Try the other way." The screen became alternately a dazzling silver and a blackness shot through with meteorites. "Let me have a go, Dad," said David. "Don't interfere," said Mrs. Watson. "Your father knows what he's doing. Now, there, that's better." It was still raining, but they could tell some horses were galloping round a circus ring. Mr. Watson went back to his chair. At that moment, the picture began to float upwards. It was followed by another, a leisured string of pictures. Plop, plop, plop. "Your vertical hold's gone," said David. Mr. Watson tramped across the room and turned another knob with gentle fury. The picture slowed. Mr. Watson was breathing through his mustache. The picture stopped. Half out of frame, a black band through the middle of the screen. Above were galloping hooves, below horses' heads, and nodding plumes. "Ease it up," said Mrs. Watson. "It's coming. It's coming too much." The picture shot into a fuzz. Mr. Watson spun the knob in both directions, but it had no effect. He turned all the controls separately and together. He switched the set off and on again several times. He tried other channels. Nothing worked. "Oh, leave it off," said Mrs. Watson. "It would happen on Friday." "Never mind," said Mr. Watson. "I'll phone the shop first thing in the morning." "That's not now, is it?" What are we going to do? There's tonight's paper, dear, if you'd like to look at that. Oh, very well, thank you. Mrs. Watson took the evening paper and made a point of reading it. Every minute or so she would turn the pages fretfully and hit them into shape as if they were responsible for the television breakdown. Mr. Watson sat in his chair gazing at the fire. David and Roland brought themselves books from upstairs. Nicholas started to glance through a pile of magazines. Helen doodled on the cover of one of the magazines, giving a film star a mustache, beard, and glasses. "Isn't it quiet?" she said. "I'm going to listen to my transistor," said Nicholas. "That's a good idea," said Mrs. Watson. "Fetch it down, Nick. It'll be nice to have some music if we're reading." "I think I'll just try the TV again," said Mr. Watson. "You never know." "Don't," said Mrs. Watson. "It'll only make you bad-tempered. We'll listen to the wireless, and then I'll bring the supper. I shan't be sorry to have an early bed tonight. It's been a tiring week." "Have you messed up my transistor?" said Nicholas from the doorway. He was looking at David, and his face was hot. "Why should I want to touch your puny transistor when I've built a real wireless of my own?" said David. "Someone has," said Nicholas. "Is it either of you two?" "Not me," said Roland. "What's wrong with it?" "You listen," said Nicholas, and he pushed the button of his portable radio. A whooping noise rose and fell against a background of atmospheric crackle that drowned any broadcast. "It's the same on all stations. It was okay this morning, so who's wrecked it?" "Wait a minute," said David. He put down his book and ran upstairs. "I promise I've not touched your wireless," said Helen. "No one's been in your room all day, Nick," said Mrs. Watson. "That's another washout, then," said Nicholas. He flopped into the chair and snatched open a magazine. "My radio's conked, too," David called. "It must be a magnetic storm." "Would it stop the TV?" said Mrs. Watson. "No," said David. "That doesn't work the same way." Nobody could sit still for long. It was so unnatural for the room to be quiet. There was a tension in the silence, as if a clock had stopped. Mr. Watson thumbed the pages of a gardening catalogue. He whistled a tune to himself, but it wasted away. Every small movement made someone look up, and every sound was an irritation. Then, into the silence, there broke the noise of a car engine. It hiccuped on one cylinder, hesitated, and the remaining cylinders fired. Mr. Watson dropped his catalogue. "That's our car," he said. "Nonsense, Frank. I tell you, it's our car." He pulled back the curtain that stopped the draught from the front door, slid the catch, and ran out onto the footpath in his carpet slippers. "Frank, you'll catch your death!" They all chased after Mr. Watson and came upon him standing outside the padlocked garage door. Inside the garage, the car engine throbbed, about to stall. "Go and bring a torch and the key, Nick," said Mr. Watson. The engine picked up again. "How can it be? How's he broken in?" said Mrs. Watson. "I don't know, dear," said Mr. Watson. "It's very funny." "Perhaps it's a ghost," said David. "David!" said Mrs. Watson. "Oh, no. Do you think it is?" said Helen. "Of course not. You see what happens when you say stupid things?" "Sorry, Mum," said David. "Only a joke." Even so, when Nicholas had brought the key and Mr. Watson unlocked the door, everyone felt a creeping of the scalp as the door swung open. The car stood in a haze of exhaust smoke. Nobody was in the garage. The ignition was switched off, and the key was in Mr. Watson's pocket. He sat in the driving seat and frowned at the dashboard. "Aha!" he said with an attempt at understanding. "Ah!" "What is it, Dad?" said Nicholas. "I've not put the choke right back in." Mr. Watson stuck his finger against one of the knobs. The engine died. "There'd be just enough petrol seeping through to fire the engine," he said. "Now then, all inside out of the cold, the mystery's solved. Come along." "But, Dad," Roland heard David say as he helped Mr. Watson shut the door, "you'd still need the ignition on to start the motor, wouldn't you?" If Mr. Watson replied, Roland did not hear him. The diversion made half an hour pass. It was good to come to the fire from the dark, and they gathered round the hearth, warming their hands and talking away the uneasiness they had all felt in front of the locked garage. But the heat of the fire drove them apart to their own little islands in the room. Mr. and Mrs. Watson faced each other in armchairs. David and Roland, with their shoes off, were competing from behind their books for an unfair share of the sofa. Nicholas sat on a leather poof, reading the advice columns in all the magazines. Helen was drawing heads on profile Helen was drawing heads in profile looking to the left. She could never draw them looking to the right. The evening dribbled on. "Hark!" said Mrs. Watson. "What's that?" "I can't hear anything," said Mr. Watson. "It's upstairs." The whole family listened. "Oh, yes," said Helen. "It's a sort of buzzing." "Shut up a minute, then," David said. "I can't—" "Oh, yes." "Go and see what it is, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. "The immersion heater may not be plugged in properly." "Then shall we have supper?" said Mr. Watson. "I could do with a bite." His soft, heavy tread creaked on the stairs. "Now what's your father up to, I wonder?" said Mrs. Watson after several minutes. "Has he gone to bed? It'd be just like him." "No," said Roland. "He's coming. The noise is louder, too." Mr. Watson came downstairs as slowly as he had climbed. He halted in the doorway of the room. His face was blank with unbelief. In one hand he held his electric razor. The razor was working, although in the other hand Mr. Watson held the loose end of the flex. "It's my razor," he said. "Well, can't you stop it?" said Mrs. Watson. "Can't you switch it off?" "There's nothing to switch off. You plug it into the light." "But that's ridiculous, Frank. It's not plugged into anything." "You must be able to switch it off." "I can't, dear. It works from the mains." "Then what's it doing now?" "I don't know, dear." Mr. Watson put the razor on the table. Its vibrations made it turn like the head of a tortoise. "It was in its case, on top of the medicine cupboard. It's nearly shaken itself off. I had a job to catch it." "Dead weird, isn't it?" said Nicholas. "The power must be coming from somewhere, unless there's a fault." "There's no fault in the razor," said David. "It's going perfectly." "I don't like it," said Helen. "It's almost alive. It's spooky." "David," said Mrs. Watson, "I will not have you putting such things into other people's heads. You know there must always be a perfectly simple explanation for everything that happens. There's obviously something wrong with the razor. We'll take it back to the shop tomorrow and let a qualified electrician see it." I'll wrap it in a towel and put it away," said Mr. Watson, "or else it'll get on our nerves. I must say, I wouldn't have thought it." "Now we're all up, let's have supper," said Mrs. Watson. "Will you bring the trolley through, please, Roland, for the cups and saucers? I'll go and put the kettle on." "It's still pretty spooky, whatever Mum says," David muttered. "No, David," said his father. "Well, it is, Dad. You can't run away from it. Things don't start by themselves. You must have something to—" Mrs. Watson's scream interrupted him. They rushed through into the kitchen and found her staring at the electric food mixer, which was spinning at top speed. "Switch it off!" cried Mrs. Watson. "It is switched off, Mum," said Nicholas, and he took the plug from out of the socket to be certain. The mixer did not falter. "It started," said Mrs. Watson. "I was nowhere near it." "Now will you believe me?" said David. As if to back him up, the drum of the washing machine slowly began to turn behind its glass door. "It's all right, dear," said Mr. Watson. "There'll be a fault in the supply. David, go and switch off the mains, and we'll see." David pressed a lever on the electricity meter, and all the lights in the house went out, but the mixer and the washing machine threshed away in the darkness. "Very well," said Mr. Watson. "Put the lights on." They ate a poor supper. Mrs. Watson was upset, but Mr. Watson said that nothing could be done at the moment, and that they should try to have a good night's sleep. It would all be put right in the morning. It was not a fault in the mains, so there was no danger. Nevertheless, he gave himself away by setting up a camp bed for Helen in his room. Now no one would be alone. At first, the boys tried to talk when they were in bed, but their father called to them to go to sleep, so they lay awake through the night, listening to the machinery. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the food mixer burned itself out, but the washing machine rumbled on. The children and their parents stared clear-eyed at the dark. And that is the end of chapter 10.